The show Inside Out kind of came, at least about for me. I was this summer reading an interview by an artist named Teresita Fernández, and it was just like a really, to me, compelling way of thinking about landscape, thinking about sort of what is in the landscape that is unseen, that's kind of the history of the landscape, and potentially ways that the landscape maybe speaks to us about itself, not necessarily in the way like I usually paint. I go out and paint what I see, but it's not necessarily like digging deeper. So one of the things I was interested in doing is bringing together some artists that I felt like really did do some of those things, or really were kind of seeing like a little bit below the surface, or thinking about the history of place, or like connecting to place in a different way than I do. So specifically, one of the quotes that I felt like was a guiding light was from an essay that she wrote. It was a exhibition essay called "Sometimes Landscape is About What You Can't See." And in it, she wrote, she wanted to offer the idea that landscape's not a fixed vista in front of our eyes, but instead an ever-changing portrait of people and places, to plant the seed that landscape is sometimes more about what you see, you don't see, than what is shown in the picture. So kind of the idea that it's like deeper than that, and that there is more there necessarily than you'd see in a painting of a landscape. And so I felt like all of these artists, or I guess I should say a realistic painting of a landscape, I felt like all the artists in the show are really, connecting in different ways that speak to what she's saying. So I'm going to have Dom introduce individual artists. We're going to first, I'll show, and I'm going to do another screen share. So I don't know if everybody will be able to see it, but it will just be still images. I'm going to show some of Polonia Odahara Novack's pieces while Dom is telling us about her. Then we're going to hear from and see some work from Dean Trisko, and then Karen Kopacz.
So Polonia Odahara Novack makes forms and combines objects to create memorials to talk about hard truths. She is a Sansei, fourth-generation Japanese-American artist. Born in Santa Monica, California, she is a descendant of survivors. 7 of her immediate family were incarcerated in an American concentration camp during World War II. Her formative years were infused by living on the edge of the Pacific in a postmodern Southern California landscape within a crucible of diversity, surf, and car culture. Social justice and environmental issues continue to inform her work. Clay-related studies range from learning pre-Columbian hand-building techniques from the matriarchal family of the Zapotec potters in San Marcos, Tlapazola, Oaxaca, Mexico, to M.N. Nice, an advanced certificate program at Northern Clay Center, Minneapolis, Minnesota. And the piece in Inside Out is called Albedo Effect, and features her characteristic thoughtful use of clay forms.
So maybe, Polonia, if you want to talk maybe a little bit about your work. Sorry, I thought I had it all open, but of course, snafus. So I'm going to kind of just go through some of the pieces, and if you want to tell us a little bit about them.
Okay, thanks, Laura. Thanks, Dom. Albedo effect. Albedo in Latin means white. And I was thinking about the loss of Arctic sea ice when I made this piece. And I think about landscape like that, ice, the summer ice, the winter ice, and this is where animals live. And if you're a seal, if you're a walrus, where do you give birth if there's no ice? What's happening is the albedo effect is the reflection of light and radiation back into the atmosphere. But what's happening is the ice isn't forming as densely and covering as large an area anymore. So then open water happens. And when open water occurs, it's dark and it absorbs heat. And once the ocean absorbs that heat stays in the ocean. I mean, it doesn't easily dissipate. It's not going to dissipate, actually. The ocean has absorbed most of the CO2 and the heat. We live in an atmosphere here on land, and we think of measuring CO2 in the atmosphere that we inhabit, when actually the Earth, because of the oceans, have absorbed a lot more CO2 and heat than I think people realize. So I try to make work that is about space and time, but it's always a conundrum for me because I don't know exactly how to memorialize an ongoing catastrophe. So I thought that piece was really perfect for the theme that Laura and Dom presented for the show. So that's why I selected that one. And I make these forms using 100-year-old cherry wood molds that are hand carved. They're called kashigata. And there's no more people, the carvers are all passing away. And they were originally used to make confections, sweets, to eat and offset with the bitterness of matcha, like during tea ceremony. And they've also were used when they were confections put on like Shinto on altars, so they wouldn't spoil. They would have a long shelf life. But I collect these molds, and I'm really attached to the clam form because my family never talked to us about their experiences when they were incarcerated. And it was a really traumatic, devastating event for them. They're all passed away. And now I have all these questions that I would like to ask them, but they're gone and I can't ask them anymore. So I imagine all my questions on the outside of this clam form, and the answers on the inside, they're locked in and I'll never be able to access them. And this is a image that's up on the screen right now is really a self-portrait. I made a little typo and I said that I am Sansei, but it's really third generation, not fourth generation. But the bowl, the raku bowl there, that's 3 written in Japanese. And that's my grandfather, Ishimatsu Odahara, and my auntie, Gracie Odahara. And they're pictured there in front of the barracks that they lived in at Manzanar in California. So it's sort of like a family history self-portrait there. But I'm really challenged by trying to make work that is, I kind of feel initially I need to kind of seduce people to want to look at it, because these conversations about what the work is about are hard. They're not always comfortable. They're not comfortable and they're challenging. So I always want to seduce the viewer first to be interested in looking at it and then talking about what these things mean. And if I don't get a chance to explain them, that's fine. It's not I don't know. I work conceptually, and you know how conceptual artists are. After the idea, everything else doesn't matter. The idea is, or the concept is most important. So that's kind of it in a nutshell.
Thank you, Polonia. That was awesome. All right, I'm gonna take a sec, and I think next up is Dean. I'm trying to be organized, but it is a bit of a challenge for Laura. I won't lie. Take that connections. And then Dom, if you want to start reading the intro, I will pull these up and then I can screen share them.
Dean Trisko is an abstract artist who holds a Bachelor of Fine Arts from the University of Minnesota and a Master of Fine Arts from Idaho State University. He was visual arts faculty at Minneapolis College for many years and has taught workshops at Grand Marais Art Colony. He maintains a studio at the Northrop King Building and shows regularly at Art-A-Whirl, the Northeast Minneapolis Arts Association Fall Fine Art Show, and the Northrop King's Art Attack. Dean makes abstract art, drawings, paintings, and prints. Landscape and the local environment are often subjects that initiate his desire to make art. His process is similar to the classic steps of abstraction, observing visual subjects, then reducing, exaggerating, and editing until most hints of representation are gone.
Thanks, Dom. Should I go on? Yeah, I mean, I guess my work primarily comes out of, first off, I guess my joy of making things. And I've just been kind of hooked on that ever since I was a teenager. But the other thing is, I like how art can take me into sort of a reflective or contemplative state. I don't know if that's exactly the right way of saying it, but kind of like meditation, but more like just slowing down and appreciating, I guess it is. And I guess the best word I have for that is aesthetics or beauty. And I guess that's what gets me started. And while I don't work from landscape exclusively, it's heavily landscape because that's the one thing that for me is really easily approachable. But I love just kind of gazing upon a group of trees, or maybe the shadow from some trees, or maybe the sky, or things like that. And then once that urge kind of gets into my head and my mind's eye, if you will, then I want to, I guess, hang on to or put down some of that. But over the years, I've found that no matter how hard I tried to replicate that moment, the moment really existed in my mind. And so that led me to abstraction in the sense that it kind of became a three-way dialogue. There was nature and me looking at it, but then there's also what was happening on my canvas. And it sort of became an interaction between all three, me looking, but then me also reacting, me putting something down, changing it. I guess part of what got me to pursue abstraction so much was that just replicating, I wanted to go further. I love the surprise when I'm making an artwork. What I would call the unknown. I guess we could call it creativity, you know, and just trying to search for and see if something can happen, something can pop up. And so some of my works are more literal of the landscape, and then some depart, and then some depart more and more. And one of the things I guess I wrote about a little in my statement, I think, was it doesn't really matter if the viewer to me sees landscape in it. It's more finding that moment of reflection or beauty for themselves. I mean, if it can echo a little of what I felt, that's terrific. But maybe they have their own resonance with it, their own understanding of how it works. And I'm perfectly okay with that. Unlike Polonia's work, I don't have a big conceptual paradigm I'm working with. It's much more of a interactive, formal experience, I suppose you could say. But it's also a way of me just putting down what I like to do with the materials, with creativity, with the formal effects, whether it's patterns, colors, space, line, that sort of thing. And, you know, if we get to having some questions, please let me know. I'll talk further about different pieces, but maybe that's enough for now.
Thanks, Dean. All right, we're gonna move over to Karen. Dom, you want to take it away? I'm gonna try to pull up some of Karen's work.
Karen Kopacz is a visual artist and writer and a graduate of Columbia College in Chicago with a fine arts BA and a minor in creative writing. Karen's business Design for the Arts, established in 2000, supports artists, local business owners, and environmental organization leaders in design, branding development, and website consultation. In 2020, Karen acquired 6 acres of woodland along a wild and scenic river and is working towards building a creative studio that will eventually be nestled within the oak, maple, and pine. Until then, being with and working with the woodlands has generously served to inform the direction of her long view vision for the project making, gathering, and collaboration. The 6 drawings on display in this exhibit, Inside Out, belong to a larger collection of works that elevate stories about natural protected areas and our relationships with land, water, and each other. Each drawing highlights a characteristic of a specific place in nature to encourage dialogue about complex issues and expand thinking for how nature is perceived.
Okay, so thank you, Dom. So this project I've been working on has been going on for probably 6 or more years, and I'm really excited to finally be sharing it. And one of the reasons that it's taken so long to start to put it out into the world is because the drawings are representative of natural areas throughout the Midwest, and I became really intrigued by these areas that I was drawing and researching, and decided to take a road trip through each state throughout the Midwest in 3 loops. So I was visiting the places that I'd already sort of researched and drawn, which informed a larger project that will someday be released as a book with the drawings and the stories. So each of these drawings belongs to a larger collection of natural areas that have been impacted environmentally or have or are just ecologically significant or important. And also there are a lot of stories that connect in with how people are impacted. And a lot of the drawings I wanted to create, instead of showing sort of the issues, I wanted to create them showing their beauty so that they could open a pathway for dialogue that would be perhaps a little bit easier, since sometimes it is tricky to talk about environmental issues and And I wanted to reach a larger audience, so not only people who were interested in environmental issues. So that's kind of the overview of the project. Some of maybe an example of these would be I think it's the first one, the first drawing. Yes. So this drawing is where the tall grass still grows. And it's a drawing of a burn area in the Flint Hills and the Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve in Kansas. And what it's showing is this burn area is exposing all of the rocky terrain beneath the grasses. And those rocks are what prevented early colonial settlers from farming the land. And so it is one of the largest preserves of tallgrass prairie in the US because of that rock. And I think it's just such a great way to show how the inadvertent accident of that, and how often we how often the case is that you don't think about the consequences of actions. So that's an example of that. And then one other quick example is the sway of nature, law, and sprawl, which is, that one. So this is an image of the St. Croix River, which is a wild and scenic river. It is the border of Minnesota and Wisconsin, and the drawing is depicting an issue that was ongoing for about a decade that had to do with constructing a bridge across from Minnesota to Wisconsin. And you can see that, I'll go back. So the bridge had a lot of different stakeholders and who were trying to defend all of their respective things that they were trying to preserve. And so one was the national park system was legally obliged to preserve the banks of the river, of the wild and scenic river. And then there was a historic footbridge or a historic bridge that somebody else had was legally obliged to preserve. And so it was a really complex issue, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But ultimately the bridge was built, and I was told that by a local resident that some eagles were displaced when the construction started. And so you're seeing the eagle kind of drawn into the ripples of the river. And then above it, if you look up sort of above its wings, you can see there's some swirls on either side of the river, and that shows where the bridge would have, where the bridge is. But I didn't show the bridge in the drawing. I wanted to kind of erase that to put a finer point on the story. So those are some of the things that I think kind of resonate with this show in terms of landscape and impact and what you see, what you don't see. I'll just leave it there for now and answer questions later if there are any.
Thank you, Karen. So I'm going to grab, we got a big stack of questions. I'm going to just direct them to the artist they're for, and I will try to, if possible, pull up the piece that they're about, because most of them are about like specific pieces for the show, from the show, excuse me. So the first one is for Dean. Let's see if I can share this. Boom. And one of them is also about a piece that I don't have an image of, so I'll ask that
Okay.
too. So did a specific connection inspire you? Is there a specific interpretation for you? Or what connection are you trying to get to the audience?
Okay. Those are all really great and valid questions, and yet I feel I'm going to sort of deflate the importance of those questions a little bit, in that titles for me are often difficult, in that, like I say, I really like the viewer to relate as much of their own viewing experience. But so for me, just to go to the title, Connections, it partly had to do with just connections to my wife, who likes summertime and swimming and things like that. And it just kind of occurred to me. The painting itself, it's a 2-panel piece, so I guess we'd call it a diptych. And I think I actually started more with the piece on the right-hand side, but very quickly I felt the composition just needed to keep expanding. It was, again, using nature, certainly trees and light, particularly kind of that full summer kind of, the greens, the heat, but also the cool of shadows, some of that. This piece really left its original inspiration fairly quickly, and just some of the geometry, some of the shapes, the light really started just guiding me and pulling me through it. I added the second. I happen to have a second panel handy, and actually was painting over on both panels a previous painting I didn't care for, but I hadn't planned it on being 2 pieces, but it just, the composition started to grow, I guess you could say, but really seemed to want more. And I suppose the fact that it's 2 panels then kind of made the connection between me and my wife a little more so. But I don't expect anybody else to see that or to have that kind of a literal association. I do hope that maybe there's a little sense of, again, maybe just the joy of light and looking in the work. I mean, that's what really triggers my aesthetic sense, my sense of awe, I guess you'd call it, or wonder. Part of what's really called me into being an artist is just having those moments of sort of wonder of looking, wonder of seeing. The longer I look at something, and I guess by look, I mean not looking for meaning, but just gazing over the surface of something, the more it becomes kind of, I become enraptured by it, like the way I see a shadow and then a light and then a shape and then a color, and then, just kind of, and pretty soon I'm thinking painting or drawing, or maybe making a print. And so, I hope the questioner isn't disappointed that I haven't quite really nailed an exact connection that I wanted to make, because there really isn't.
Okay.
It's whatever connection is good for people is good with me.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Dean. I appreciate it. My next question is for Polonia. I'm going to try to bring these pieces up. I feel like things work before you're recording, and then as soon as you record, it's like things are sized weird and they don't display right. So my apologies. Let's see. Boom. Let's see the other 2. Let's skip those. There we go. Okay. There we go. So the questioner is interested in your piece albedo effect, and they wanted to know, how did you get the mixture of colors in the clay or in your glazes? And then their second part of their question was, do you ever have pieces that can be touched, like that have a touchable component?
Those are both very good questions. When I soda firing in an atmospheric kiln, and you're doing it with a group, it can be a little, I mean, it's not really possible to always predict the results. And so over the course of working on the program at Northern Clay, I was able to fire and participate in quite a few soda firings. And I learned early on that when I tucked my pieces into the kiln, depending upon whether it was tightly packed or loosely packed, because the soda rides on the flame as it's going through the kiln. I learned early on, if I wanted to get a group of forms that had relatively the same kind of surface effect, I had to gang them together in batches instead of putting a piece here and tucking a piece there. The light blue, the white, those aren't glazed. They're just fired naked with no glaze in the kiln, and any shininess is a result of the soda that's introduced at a certain temperature. It's the soda solution gets sprayed in and immediately turns to a gas and rides on the flame and coats the work. So the lighter color, blue green, was Celadon. And it's really interesting because I didn't know that this was going to happen, but the ripple effects in it is the atmosphere in the kiln. When the glaze turns liquid, it kind of took on a form looking like ripples in water. And the dark blue, very, very dark blue, black to represent open water, that was a bucket of glaze that was mystery glaze. And I just, it just turned out like that. That was just a total random happy accident. Let's see. So color was the first question, and oh, the touching question. I have to say yes. I know that it's probably torturous for some people to see the work and not be able to pick it up. When I do sell some of my work, and when people pick up this form, I don't know. I've been trying to understand what happens when they pick up this clam form, and I'm trying to intellectually, I guess, figure out why a lot of people respond this way. They pick it up and I can see their whole physiology change. And when I was doing research on clams, I did deep research on clams and clam middens. When human beings settled, even before they developed agriculture, they would settle along rivers and oceans, and they would harvest shellfish for protein. And they would discard their shells of the oysters, the clams, and the mussels, and they would create giant mounds called shell middens. And some of these shell middens are miles long, very tall, and you can see them from space. So I'm kind of guessing that we might have something in our DNA that we recognize this form. It might be something that's kind of primal and it's programmed into us over thousands of years, but people really do, they really want to pick it up. So
I think that's why they asked it too, because like they were resisting, but
they were
they
tortured.
wanted to. Yeah. They wanted to.
You could let them know if you're doing a tour or something and people want to pick them up, it's fine. They're very, they can take it.
Okay, thank you, Polonia.
Mhm.
Okay, the next question is for Karen, and I'm gonna try to pull the piece up. Again, it's like I get better at this by the end. Oh, well, okay. Here we go. There it is. Okay, so the question is, and there's two questions that I got that are kind of similar, so I'm gonna layer them together. The first questioner asked, what inspired Karen Kopacz to make this piece? Is there a meaning, which you did talk about already? And then they wanted to know if the original is ink, which it is, but if you want to kind of talk about maybe your process a little, like how you drew it. And then their second question, which is another person had a similar question, is, do you draw this from your mind? Do you use any visual references? And then another person asked, how do you layer them? Like, is that kind of just from your imagination?
Those are great questions too. So I draw them in ink. I do not use pencil. And because of that, I often will sit for a long time sort of mapping it out in my mind, what I want it to look like or what I want to highlight. I will often use either photography from that I've taken or photography that I find online that I change so that I'm using multiple sources and not copying any, one particular photograph or anything like that. And I also really like to research deeply the different things that are present in the landscape where I'm drawing, and make sure that they, that those are all grasses, flora, flowers, things that are part of that ecosystem. And when I'm doing that, I sometimes will abstract things and kind of pull something that's small up and make it larger. And so in this drawing, you can see an example of that with the mosses, and they're sort of in the middle on the right, kind of tucked underneath the grasses, and they're sort of what I like to think of as illuminated. And you can see there, I think they're called sporophytes, those little dangling things that are kind of bent over. And so one of the reasons that I'm highlighting that particular item in the drawing is because I've done some research, I've read some research papers, I should say, on macro remediation and remediation using bryophytes and liverworts and mosses. And there was a paper that I read that was really interesting, that seemed to indicate that those bryophytes, when introduced to a landscape that had been strip mined, would help remediate it much faster than if they weren't present. But the bryophytes are also very vulnerable to impacts like strip mining. And so I was really interested in bringing that forward. So you'll see things kind of abstracted in my drawings, even though I'm trying to also point out a lot of sort of the literal depictions of things as well.
Thank you. Okay. All right, I have one more question for each of you, and then if any guests have questions, they can jump those in. Next one's for Dean. And I'm gonna pull up maybe a different one. Well, I'm gonna pull up. No, I'll pull up the same one. No, I lied. I keep going back and forth. I'm sorry.
Do a
I'm being
different one.
I'm being that guy. Let's do a different
Okay.
one. Okay. Let's do this one.
But
Boom. Okay. Here's the question.
yes,
I can see some strokes with unique colors and directions underneath other strokes. How do you build up your paintings?
yeah. Wow. So I love the technical question because that's where I'm more comfortable. Lately, my work has just gotten more and more layered, and it isn't really a thing I set out to do and at the beginning. And I'm happy if a painting actually happens without too many layers. But I think part of the abstraction process for me often is covering things up, adding things, sometimes it's also scraping away. I just finished a painting where I tried 2 or 3 tries, and each time I kind of scraped it back down to not much. And now it's very black and white with just little peaks of color coming through. In this one, it's kind of out of a series, and I call it the return series because I keep returning to it literally. But it's kind of looking out into the treetops through a window in my house. But it's gotten, that project has gone from being more geometric, because I've been doing now for maybe 5 years or so. This one is a pretty recent one. I think worked on it last summer. I really like mixing color and getting the nuance of the intensity or the chroma just the way I like it. And that kind of speaks to me of nature, but it also speaks to, I guess, my delight in seeing colors interact together and look a certain way. And so I kind of enjoy those little peeks and glimpses of the things underneath. This one in particular, you can see some of the places where I've literally scraped paint while it's still wet, and you can kind of see through some of those layers underneath. Sometimes the paintings evolve quite a bit, and I think this one has some kind of warmer yellows and kind of golden colors, maybe even some pinks in the base tone. But then I started picking them up right near the end again too, and kind of bring it full circle. This one got stuck, as they often do for me, and then I set it aside for a week or two and came back, and then I kind of re-envisioned it with a different sort of attitude, I guess you could say, but really just a different sort of atmospheric, should we say, light condition. I guess, in other words, I saw the trees one day in a different way, and I was like, what could I do with that light? What could I do with that color? Now, again, it's literally not the trees, but it's kind of some of the interactions of light and space that I've enjoyed. And I was also pretty pleased when it just kind of started to find its own little life, and was happy when Laura wanted to include it in the show.
Thanks, Dean. All right, the next question is for Polonia. Let's see if I can pull. And I could pull up, this one's a little bit more, I guess, general. So let me see if I can pull up one of the other pieces you shared with us and actually make it work. Okay, I think. My nightmare is that while I'm putzing, I just log us completely out. Okay. So their question for you, it's kind of a 2-parter, and you answered this a little bit, but I just want to kind of honor the question. Are there shapes, or what shapes or forms are your inspiration for ceramic objects? And are there things, do they bring back memories from your life? So are there inspirations, and do they bring back memories?
Ooh, good question. I think that the shapes and the forms of these animals that live in the ocean are part of my identity, and the language of memory. And there's been such dramatic shifts in my lifetime. Okay, I'm in my 60s, and in the last 50 years, there's no more large fish that you can catch off the pier where I grew up at. The big fat female fish and human beings, they're quite different. When fish get older, they don't lose their fertility, and they're really, really important for population. But so many of these mature fish are gone, and you don't catch them anymore. So those animals, you know, those 50-pound halibut that I remember people catching off the Redondo Beach Pier, no more. They're gone. So I think these forms are, for me, part of my language of memory, and it's a way for me to, I think, remember them so they don't disappear. So they're not, oh, yeah, I don't want them to be invisible. I want to make them visible because they're still around. They just maybe exist in smaller numbers. And so, yeah, shape, inspiration. What was the next, was there second part to the question?
I think just memories, like what, and you
Yeah.
kind of talked about that, but like, are there any memories that are connected for you with the shapes?
Yeah, I have first and foremost a very big attraction to wood. And so I collect these molds, and I specifically choose molds that are of naturally occurring, like plants and animals. And I really tried to find a way to take these molds and create work with them, so that these molds, they're still used, they're still viable, they still, you know, create forms. They may not be an object which we eat or which we put on a shrine, like a Shinto shrine in home. But for this particular piece, I was just wondering about how do animals that live in a different atmosphere, if they're in distress, how do they call for help? Well, we can't hear them, but that's what really was the motivator for this piece. So yeah, I think it's just part of the language of my life, of my memory. And they're very familiar to me. They may like appear, maybe somebody who grew up and haven't spent a lot of time at the ocean. They probably are kind of maybe exotic or really interesting looking, but for me, they're pretty recognizable. And I don't know, I just had to, I had a friend that was a diver there. This is the Elk Quadrangle in Mendocino, California. And the red abalone that used to grow north of the Golden Gate, they're anywhere from 12 to 17 inches in diameter. They're a snail, it's a mollusk, and the foot is what stays attached to the rock. Anyway, the harvest season for these closed in 2017 because the population is decimated. And I don't know if they're going to ever reopen harvest for the red abalone. So it's a little bit of a memorial. I created a little bit of a memorial to these animals. And yeah.
Thanks, Polonia.
Mhm.
Okay, I've got one more question for Karen. Let me try to pull the specific piece up. So, okay. And they wrote it down. Okay, hand painted. Yes. Okay. So this one's a two-parter too. What are the subjects that look like coral to the viewer? That was their first part of their question. And then what makes you use ink or enjoy using ink?
Oh, what was the first? I'm not sure
Yeah, I think what they're
following.
talking about is the shapes kind of to the left of the flower near the bottom. That's my impression, that those to
Okay.
them looked like coral and they were interested in like, and I'm assuming it's sort of the in the ground plane, that texture.
Yeah.
They wanted to know more about what that was specifically. And
Okay.
then also kind of why do you use ink, or what do you love about ink, or maybe talking a little bit about the medium.
Okay. So, well, I'll start over on the lower right just to inform the context. The lower right is a wild poppy that I saw and photographed on my trip to the Sandhills in Nebraska. And this drawing is a depiction of the largest hand-planted forest in the US that was planted in the Sandhills. And I went off road on, I like to take little detours and just sort of explore when I'm doing road trips. And on one of my detours, I had found this wild poppy that was on the side of the road, and I had kind of a moment with it and just loved the way that it was, just how, that like fragile sort of petals blowing in the wind. And this particular poppy had a leaves that were very sort of, I'm not sure how to describe, but you can see in the lower right, there's sort of almost thistly. And I really loved those shapes. And then over to the left are, I think that those are cedar trees. I'd have to go back and look at my references and my photographs, but I'm pretty sure those are cedar trees. And then there's grass along sort of the ground of that, and the grasses are kind of flowy. And when I was in the Sandhills, it was so hot and windy, and I just remember looking out at this vast landscape that was, I mean, you could, if you on first sight, you could almost say it looks barren, but it's just not. There's so much going on out there. But I remember those grasses like really having an effect on me with their texture and how they would blow in the wind. And then the trees are just these rows of hand-planted pine trees. Those are jack pines. And we know now that planting a monoculture is not a great way to create a forest, or to nurture a forest. But this one is pretty interesting because a botanist named Charles Bessey really fought to get this forest going. And he fought for at least a decade, trying to cultivate this forest that a lot of people thought was like a fantasy, because who could grow a forest in the, what they called the Midwestern desert? But he did, and now this forest is, it replenishes trees in 5 states that have loss due to fire or insect infestation, things like that. A little bit off topic of the question, but
No, and I think that helped. I think they were feeling like where you were talking about the cedar and the grass, that it almost has like this ocean flow, even though it's terrestrial. So they just were interested in that.
yeah, and then just to sort of put a fine cap on it, the I'm not sure why I went with ink initially. Initially I was doing work that was bright with like pastels and these bright colors, and I don't know how it all started to go into ink, but it did. And when I found that medium, I loved how I could get into the detail, and I could create these really interesting sort of detail-oriented textures. And so I guess the last thing I'll say is there's a lot of mistakes in my drawings, and you can't just really just start over. Like, you have to commit. Because I'm not using pencil, I have to find ways to make the mistakes work for the drawing. And so you'll see in this drawing in the lower left, there's almost what looks like flames or something kind of starting to emerge. And that's usually because there's been a mistake, but I feel like it works for the drawing. And sometimes I'll try to integrate new aspects of the storyline where those mistakes occur. And it's a lot of times they become a little more interesting as well, I think, because of those mistakes.
Thanks, Karen. Does anybody in the group have questions for anybody else? Yay. All right. Well, it's been such a pleasure catching up with you all, hearing more about your process. Thank you all. Such a pleasure to spend time with you this Thursday night, and enjoy your beautiful work. Have a wonderful rest of your week, folks.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Bye.
Ciao.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. That was a great conversation.
Yay.